The fourth and final little topic that we're going to deal with as part of this introduction to ethics is about how the context, the business context, can affect individual level ethical decision making and behaviour. So to do that, we're going to look at two things in the main. The first is this idea of integrity and ethical integrity, because I think we need to understand the nature of this consistency in decision making that underpins the idea of an ethical life. The second thing that we'll then do is look at some of the forces that we know from psychology, in particular, and sociology, that can alter the decisions that we might make, and then think about how those contexts arise in organisations and therefore affect our integrity and our personal ethical position. So the first thing we want to look at is this idea of a person having integrity. Okay, so we've got our dictionary definition here of the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles that you refuse to change. Okay. Now notice that they invoke the word moral. Why? Because you might have strong principles but still engage in things that are unethical. And so the example we have in the slides here is that you could be loyal, but you could be loyal to a crime syndicate. So there's an old saying about honour among thieves, right? So that there's kind of two levels in which we can talk about this ethics. Goes back to that idea of ethical relativism. Now, we've said ethical relativism is a bit of a problem. So in order to work out what are strong moral principles, we tend to refer to moral principles as those that involve not just what you're doing, etc., but your relationship to others and what is good. So how is your relationship to others judged as good? Now, if a person truly accepts some moral standards, three things flow. The first thing that flows is that you want to align with the standard. You want to act and behave in line with that standard positively. The second thing that occurs is that you feel responsible when you don't, and we often see that come out as guilt. So if you don't act in accordance with your own moral standards, you feel bad about it. The third thing is that you start to criticize those who don't apply the standard or don't live up to the standard that you have in place. So let's go back a bit and understand this. So in order to have integrity, you're going to have strong moral principles. If you have strong moral principles, it means that you have moral standards that you will act on, that you will feel guilty if you breach, and that you will criticize, either in your head or overtly, other people who don't comply with them. So a very simple example, if someone in a business setting, if an employee accepts the principle one shouldn't mislead potential customers, he or she will be motivated to act honestly. They'll want to be honest, right? They'll feel guilty if they lie, and they'll look down or disapprove on others who do this misleading. So it's about the consistency in decision and how it affects our rewards and emotions and how we judge others. Once we consistently maintain these standards, we're said to have strong personal integrity. So we're going to look at some ways you can judge moral standards next week and the week after. But for this particular session, I think we've got to recognise that we live and work in institutions and organisations. So institutions can mean a societal structure like a market as much as it means a particular organisation like a university. So we live within these social forces that can affect our personal integrity, our own moral principles, and how we make decisions. One way that this gets explained is the idea of bad apples in a barrel. So we can ask, okay, so if we put unethical people in an organisation, they might turn many other people in that organisation unethical. So if you put a bad apple in a barrel of apples, that infects the other apples. Another way of thinking about the problem is that the structures of the organisation can encourage people to be unethical, right? And so in that case, we're talking about a bad barrel infecting the apples. And finally, in organisations, there's a particular view that if we get the right structures and processes and policies in place, we can create a good barrel that will ensure that our apples don't become bad, that people don't act unethically. So it's this idea of the interrelationship between the organisation and the person, or in our metaphor here, between the barrel and the apple. 4 core features of an organisation and the social forces in an organisation that can affect ethical behaviour and decision making are organisational norms, a tendency to conformity, the process and phenomena of groupthink, and the phenomena of the diffusion of responsibility. So organisational norms are really just the way they do things, what's expected within an organisation. Often people conform to those norms within an organisation. We can see these overtly in things like mission statements and value statements. It's also in the culture of the organisation. So a lot of times in business, you'll hear people talking about the culture of the organisation. And what it means is, in organisations, we're expected to do things a certain way, and that alters the way, or it can alter the way people behave and the way they make decisions. For instance, do you chase sales or profit at all costs? That's what's really valued, and is that the norm in this organisation? The second norm is a general social norm that we find is that most people conform to the rules that are in place, and even how other people perceive things. In particular, I think Arthur Ashe's experiments into this area in particular gave us some insights that people will often say and do things that they don't believe in order to conform with what's going on around them. The third one, groupthink, is kind of like that. It's subtly different though, in that this is about being a member of a group, and in organisations we have lots of teams and departments, and we want to be part of the group. And the group itself creates a sense of identity that means it feels it's morally superior and that its decision making is right. Under those conditions, the individuals within that group will rarely speak out if they think an action or decision by the group is wrong, because they want to remain part of the group. It's kind of like conformity. I mean, conformity, you don't need a group effect, right? People conform to the rules, or they conform to the behaviours of others around them, whereas groupthink is actually about that social affiliation to a group, and that can be particularly strong in organisational settings. Finally, we have the phenomena of diffusion of responsibility. So in large contexts, in crowds, and in large organisations, it can be hard to point out who is responsible for something. And when you can't do that, so for instance, if someone is being verbally attacked and there's a crowd around, everyone else can think it's someone else's job to stand up for the person, who's being shouted at. And that's that diffusion of responsibility. Whereas if you were the only person around, it's kind of pretty obvious. It's up to you to do it or not do it. So when we have organisations, sometimes it can be really unclear who's responsible for an act or a behaviour and a mission or a particular decision. And in those instances, when it's an ethical one, everyone can think, well, someone else will pull it up if it's unethical, because we have this diffusion of responsibility. The common theme here is that working in and around organisations and business institutions means that your ethical decision-making and behaviour can alter from what you might want under your personal sense of integrity. These are quite powerful social forces for most people. And it helps to explain why sometimes people do things that you go, that's crazy or crazy unethical, because many of these forces are not relayed in the stories that we hear. And they go a good deal of the way to explaining why we get particularly large-scale unethical behaviour in the business setting. Okay, so that's the introduction. We've had a look at ethics, what it is, how it varies from other standards, the idea of ethical relativism and the potential problems with it, and also the relationship between organisations and ethics, how the business context can affect an individual's ethical decision-making and behaviour. Next week, we're going to start to move on to think about how we judge whether something's ethical or not.